Hello, and thanks for tuning in from wherever you are in the world for this session of Veterans Advanced Energy Week. We hope you were able to tune in for that last session on power grid decarbonization and had the opportunity to engage with representatives from Emerson and Apex Clean Energy over the past hour. My name is Reed Blakemore, Deputy Director at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center, and I'm pleased to be joined today by an esteemed panel for our session on the future of clean transportation and new energy mobility pathways. We're here to discuss the future of the transportation sector and mobility, the decarbonization of which is absolutely necessary as we pursue our climate goals. From consumer vehicles to aviation and trucking to shipping, the Biden-Harris administration has made both electrification and decarbonization of transportation a significant part of its own climate ambitions, with innumerable technological and infrastructure pathways still on the table. To that end, we brought together a distinguished panel today to discuss the business strategies shaping the future of decarbonized mobility, the technologies enabling those efforts, and the private-public partnerships needed to deploy those opportunities at scale. Joining us are Tom Jensen, Senior Vice President of Transportation Policy at UPS, Sarah Nielsen, an Army veteran and Executive Director for Transportation Renewables and Storage at Consumers Energy, and Lauren Riley, Managing Director for Global Environmental Affairs and Sustainability at United Airlines. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. This event is on the record, and we are currently live streaming on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We encourage you to post about what you hear today and share on social media using the hashtag VetsEnergyWeek and by tagging us at AC Global Energy and Vets_Energy. If you would like to participate in our conversation, we encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A portal, but located at the bottom of your screen at any time during the event. And as your moderator, I'll incorporate those questions as appropriate during our discussion. Please note, however, only those directly engaging via the Veterans Advanced Energy app will be able to submit questions. So let's get started. Each of our panelists today represent organizations which have made pledges for carbon neutrality or net zero emissions, and I'd like to give each of them the opportunity to describe the pathways to that goal and how that goal is transforming your business strategy. Lauren, I'd like to start with you here. United Airlines set a target for net zero emissions by 2050 late last year. How is that goal transforming your business, and what key targets are you setting out to accomplish in the next several years?
Thanks, Reed, and it's a great question. Before I jump right into the challenges of decarbonizing aviation, I'd like to say a warm and sincere thank you to all of the veterans participating for your service and your commitment to this great country. So decarbonization, you hear that all the time, commitments to net zero, carbon neutrality. It's becoming a bit of a popular theme, and for good cause. We have a lot of work to do in many of the industries that are represented today. And there's a lot of really positive momentum and progress that we're seeing, in particular under this administration and within the infrastructure bill that's being reviewed and in discussion on a daily basis. United pledged to go net zero by 2050 back in December of last year, which I point out simply by the fact that we were in the midst of a severe financial crisis due to the pandemic, and we continue to be so as a commercial airline. And despite that, despite sort of the financial issues and the downsizing of the industry at large, we doubled down on our commitment to sustainability and climate change because it's the right thing to do. Our commitment is 100% green by 2050, which effectively means zeroing out the emissions from flying without relying on the use of carbon offsets. And I raise that as well, Reed, because that's a really important part of the United strategy to decarbonize. Carbon offsets are a mechanism that effectively offer a bridge, but they're projects and investments that occur outside of your own operations. And so when United was considering how do we decarbonize when we represent a fairly hard to abate industry that doesn't have a silver bullet solution, how do we take those steps forward that are material and have integrity? And so for us, that meant really trying to truly decarbonize the operations and the activities across our business. And I'm really proud of that and happy to talk about the technological pathways that will get us there. Thanks, Reed.
Thanks. I think we'll get to the technological pathways a little bit later on. But to move things right along, Sarah, I'd like to turn to you now. Consumers Energy, a major utility, in the Midwest, last year, I think in February, announced a target to reach net zero emissions by 2040, which built upon its clean energy plan that already existed for several years. 1 year later, how is that path to net zero shaping up, and where in particular do you see a utility like Consumers Energy playing a role specifically in the future of mobility?
Thanks, Reed. Um, Yeah, so we are definitely gaining momentum, I would say. So, just to quickly level set, Consumers Energy is one of the major utilities here in Michigan. We're only in Michigan. We've got gas and electric. So, when we think about net zero, we have to think about both sides of that equation. As you mentioned, last year we said net zero by 2040. And then this June, we just filed our new clean energy plan. So that's something we file every 3 years. And in this one, I think the big headline was that we said we have plans to go coal free by 2025. So that is 4 years away, that our entire utility operation is going to be coal free. And so I think that's a dramatic statement about our ambition in this space. We were originally saying we would be coal free by 2040. So we've found a way to accelerate that. So I think it just gives credence to just the speed and the momentum of this movement. So I think that's really exciting. Another highlight from that plan is by 2040, we expect to be running the grid, running our operations on 60% renewables. Largely, that's going to be solar. And, we're not Arizona, we're Michigan, but we do see a path forward for that. So I think that's exciting as well. And then finally, Reed, to your point around the mobility piece and how that plays a role, I think electric vehicles are a very important part of this. They are going to be, we anticipate the load to be pretty significant once more and more people start to buy those vehicles. But from a utility perspective, it's a very unique type of load. Because it's very flexible, more flexible than most energy uses in terms of when people need to charge. And so we're putting the steps in today to be working with customers right away around how they think about charging, when they want to charge in a way that is beneficial for the whole grid, as well as will ultimately save them money and save all customers money. So I think it's an exciting step that we're on now. And when we think about 2030, 2040, if we're learning alongside our customers in terms of how we're using those resources, I think it's going to really help optimize when that charging is happening and allow us to use the grid better than before and without needing to build more power plants.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Now finally, Tom, to turn to you briefly, UPS sits in a really interesting and unique position. You have assets across aviation, trucking, and shipping. It creates a number of a really robust range of possible emissions vectors. UPS has a goal to become carbon neutral by 2050. How is that range of kind of the scale of that challenge shaping how you're pursuing that goal? Oh, Tom, I think you're on mute.
I've only been doing this for 14, 16 now. I'm still on mute, so please excuse me. Reed, key question, as you know, and some of the things that Lauren and Sarah alluded to are the same at UPS. I mean, most folks know UPS, but we really are, a lot of moving parts on a given day. 120,000 vehicles, 588 aircraft. We move goods on the ocean, intermodal rail. So we are all, planes, trains, and automobiles to pick up and deliver almost 25 million packages around the world on a daily basis. So this is obviously a big deal for us, and we're doing it for a couple of reasons, and I'll tell you how we get there. Number one, we're hearing from our investors. Major institutional investors are saying, hey, this matters to us. And major institutional investors come to a big company and say X, Y, or Z matters. Big companies take notice, and that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. Number two, the communities we work in. We have 1,800 buildings throughout the country, and they are largely located around population centers, as you probably know, UPS facilities. So the communities we work in are asking us, what are you doing to lower your greenhouse gas emissions to help us be greener and cleaner and be more sustainable? Number three, our customers. Our customers are asking us, what are you doing? And that's a good thing again. And lastly, our employees. We've got 543,000 employees around the world, 450,000 employees in the U.S., and 20,000 veterans in the U.S. that work for UPS, which is awesome, of course. and they're asking us, what are we doing to be better citizens? So there's a variety of reasons we're doing it, but last and most importantly is the point Lauren made. It's the right thing to do. So we got huge challenges, but we also have huge opportunities because of all the size and scale and scope of UPS and all the moving parts. When you travel 3 billion miles in a year, there's ways to do this at the margin, but our challenge is going to be how do we scale it up? And we'll get into talking about electric vehicles, alternative fuels, sustainable aviation fuels, things of that nature. But again, three sub buckets, Reed, to make our target of carbon neutrality by 2050. What can we do on the ground fleet? What can we do on the aviation and air fleet side? And what can we do in those 1,800 buildings? So those are, and there's benchmarks in each area to get there in 2050. You can't do it overnight, but we have measurable, legitimate, real benchmarks, which are, making our sustainability picture better year over year. I'll leave you with one fact and we'll move on. Today, we travel, one more fact I should say, we travel 1 million miles a day in alternative fuel vehicles. 1 million miles every single day UPS travels in alternative fuel vehicles. And it's not just electricity, it's liquefied natural gas, it's renewable natural gases, it's hydraulic hybrids, it's all kinds of some hydrogen. So again, it's this rolling laboratory approach, but we want that 1 million miles a day to be 10 million miles a day. And we have to slowly ramp up there, and we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit more as we get into the program. Thank you.
No, thank you. And I think, the common theme that the three of you each mentioned is kind of how you're responding to a changing technological landscape and trying to adopt those technologies. Lauren, turning to you, you mentioned the various technological pathways that, United is currently considering. For the longest time, we've spent time talking about, sustainable aviation fuel, right, as the key. But really now, when you look at things like hydrogen, for example, you have a number of, new possibilities, new pathways, to use a word you used, that could unlock that decarbonization potential. So, when you and United look at those available pathways, how do you weigh those against each other, and what technologies are getting you particularly excited?
So several is the short answer. I mean, today, right now in aviation, as I mentioned before, there's not a single solution. I appreciate Tom's comment. I think it was a rolling laboratory approach. I mean, that very much resonates with my day to day, which is really fun and really exciting. I mean, when you think about aviation, we're responsible for about 2% of global emissions, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that number is only going to increase as, for example, ground vehicles and road fleet decarbonize, and they have solutions to do that. So that's anticipated. So as that happens and these other industries begin to decarbonize, our relative contribution to greenhouse gas emissions globally is going to continue to increase. So that's one point. Secondly, when you look at our GHG footprint, when you look at the emissions across our operations, 98% of our emissions across our operations are from the use of jet fuel. So when you think about sort of the elephant in the room or the North Star that we're trying to address, we cannot, with any credibility, talk about climate change and decarbonization without talking about jet fuel. So that is why alternative fuels like sustainable aviation fuel is so critically important to us. So sustainable aviation fuel, in a nutshell, is a renewable-based, organic, typically, biomass that's used to create the alternative to jet fuel, and it emits up to 80% less greenhouse gas emissions. What's great about it is that we can use it today in our fueling infrastructure at the airports and on our aircraft. So that's really important because it's a solution to start tackling the problem immediately. The challenge is that there's not enough of it, and it's highly expensive. It's 2 to 4 times the cost of conventional jet fuel. And when you think about the commercial aviation side and the financial impact that we've just gone through, making that business case work is, a really intellectually challenging but yet creative way to sort of approach the decarbonization challenges we're facing. So that is a critical pathway. The other thing I'll mention about SAF real quick is that, we purchased jets. We just announced with Airbus and Boeing 270 new aircraft that we're purchasing. Those planes will be in the sky for 30 years. So flying every single day for 30 years. So we have got to work within the limitations of the technology, the engines, the airframe of those jets to make sure that we can decarbonize. And that's really where SAF steps in. But in addition to that, we are starting to invest in other technologies. For example, in December, we announced an investment in a carbon capture solution. And this literally absorbs CO2 out of the atmosphere and sticks it underground. our hope and our expectation is that over time, we would be able to marry this absorbed CO2 underground with an enhanced oil recovery process to get a low carbon crude. What's nice about that is it enables us an opportunity to really use the technology we have today, which requires crude oil in a far more responsible and environmentally limiting, impact limiting capacity. So that's really exciting. But there are next generation solutions, as you mentioned, Reed. So hydrogen fuel, electric powered aircraft, those are all really promising. They're going to take 10 to 15 years to make. I mean, we are far from having the ability to really adopt those today for two reasons. One, the technology is so nascent. The batteries that we would use on our jets today would be heavier than the jet itself. So getting that off the ground is impractical. But there's a lot of very smart people across a multitude of industries really working on tackling that. Number two is the infrastructure side. So when you think about hydrogen, when you think about electrification of aircraft, it requires an entirely different infrastructure support at the airport. And so there's got to be a lot of concerted, focused thought leadership and engagement across a multitude of stakeholders to test that out, figure out what the infrastructure looks like, figure out which aircraft and which flights make sense. But it's highly promising. So we are very excited. We've made multiple investments in different electric aircraft partners. We're certainly looking at hydrogen. I imagine everybody in aviation is looking at hydrogen. It has a far longer time stamp associated with that. And so we're trying to balance the move now with the plan for the future.
And I think you mentioned, one item I'd like to pull on really quick is you mentioned, the now versus the future. And particularly for something like aviation, where you do have a really long refresh rate for a lot of your fleet. And so how do you walk that balance between, achieving, short-term decarbonization goals in your existing fleet, either through SAF or, perhaps increased engine efficiency, versus kind of gauging, how much of your fleet you do want to potentially be, run on hydrogen or one of those other game-changing technologies in the future. How do you walk that balance?
Well, I mean, it's a little bit of a puzzle, being solved every day, but with intention. So today, sustainable aviation fuel, as I mentioned, it can be used. The problem is that there's not enough. So a lot of what I spend my day doing is finding opportunities to increase supply. And that's where really the role of government and policy comes into play. And I'm sure we'll get around to that. We do need sort of that long-term signal that alternative fuels are here to stay, and they are a necessary solution in the toolkit to decarbonize aviation. And there's a lot of folks working hard to get that done. So working on that, but we also need to anticipate what the future of aviation is going to look like. So in addition to sustainability, we're looking at what is the customer going to expect in addition to a reduced footprint of the future. And so we have an investment in a vertical takeoff and landing company, which is effectively an electric aircraft that replaces your taxi cab. So you can get from downtown Los Angeles to LAX in a shorter amount of time with a far lower carbon footprint. Another investment we made is around supersonic, which has a lot of challenges to it, but a lot of opportunities to it in terms of reducing flight time and doing it in a sustainable manner. But all of these are designed to run on sustainable aviation fuel. So we need to find a way to really scale up that as a solution path, in addition to investing in these next generation technologies like electric and hydrogen.
Reed, the only thing I'd add, if I may,
Yeah, I was about to you.
Lauren's points, which are right on the money, is that this is where the intersection of technology, innovation, and policy come together. Mm-hmm. We do need some policy to help, and there needs to be incentives for developing new fuels. Mm-hmm. And some folks will say that's a tax break for a big company. Well, if United Airlines is going to get their goals, they need a little help, and it's for the greater good. Same thing from the UPS perspective. So there are some alternative fuel tax credits that currently exist in federal government. There's talk about expanding those. There's talk about a lot more money for public infrastructure and charging stations for EVs, electric vehicles. But on the aviation fuel side, I think that's really significantly, we need some policy help along the way to make that leap, because it's a significant leap. The cost differential is just about cost prohibitive. Not to speak for Lauren's company, but for ours, we pick up and deliver packages, and they don't talk back like customers, but it requires a lot of fuel. And there's a couple things we can do. We can work with an incentive on the price of the fuel. We can also work to some of the systems that have been proposed to the way you space and move aircraft, both on the ground and in the air, because you burn a lot less fuel if we can take advantage of some of these new algorithms and new systems to move aircraft. And it's really significant because the fuel burn on the ground and in the air when you're, when you're taxiing, you're circling, that really adds up, and it is kind of an Achilles heel of sorts for the transportation sector. So we think we need some policy help, and I think big companies can make the case, and that it helps communities. People want to know about communities, and this does help communities.
I totally agree, and I think there's plenty to talk about on the policy front too, with all the news about the infrastructure package that's currently rolling out of the Senate. And Lauren, just to again highlight one thing, that if United can find a way to alleviate my need to go through LA traffic to get to LAX, then I think that's the biggest win that any of us can take from this. So by all means, please pursue that.
I'm on it, Reed. I'm on it.
It'd be helpful, when we need it. I think Lauren and Tom, you both mentioned a lot of the challenges that are associated with heavy transport, right? We're looking at high energy density, and I think the other part of this ecosystem really is the consumer vehicle space. So I'd like to kind of turn to Sarah briefly before we really dive into the policy space, which is, Consumers Energy, Sarah, has shown a lot of leadership in the deployment of charging infrastructure. That includes home charging as well as the development of public stations. What are, in your mind, the big next steps here? And I think also what lessons from Consumer Energy's experience can be applied elsewhere throughout, both to other state level contexts, but also kind of, and again, this leads towards the policy conversation I want to build towards as the Biden administration particularly thinks about bigger infrastructure investment.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Let's unpack that. So I would say in terms of the residential, everyday drivers with the vehicles coming out. So our focus so far has been on enabling the charging and helping people get over range anxiety. And the paradox of that is, at least in a territory like ours, we expect upwards of 85% of charging to actually happen at home. But when people think about a car and think about charging, they're worried about what's the public infrastructure. So it's kind of like you need both sides of the piece of the puzzle here. The public infrastructure is there for emergencies as well as for peace of mind. But then you also need to make sure that home charging happens and that it's understood and that people know how to do that. So we've been really focused on the public infrastructure side of things. So I think a next step for us is to finish what we started there. So in the past couple of years, we'll have put in 200 level 2 chargers and 30 DC fast chargers within our territory. And a great lesson learned there is, when we talk about the public infrastructure, is the importance of partnering with any type of infrastructure. But we partnered with our state's environmental group because they were the ones that were dispersing the VW settlement funds. And because we were able to partner with them, we originally were budgeting for 24 DC fast chargers, but now we're able to do 37. So it's about a 50% increase because we were able to partner with them, make sure those chargers were in a place that worked for all parts of our economy and our territory. So I think that's a great success story there, and definitely a learning. And when you're thinking about that public infrastructure piece, is just to partner and understand the community, understand the tranches of money and the invested interest, and knowing how to make this happen. So I think that's huge. Another exciting thing that's kind of a bridge between the residential space and where Lauren and Tom hang out is the fleet side of things, the fleet vehicles. We just launched our program for fleets in June. And the focus initially is going to be on offering our business customers, assessments to figure out, it's kind of like, so you want to go electric, let's assess your current fleet and figure out what type of vehicles, would make the most sense based off of your driving habits, and what type of vehicles you need and idle time and all those things. And we're really excited about that because we're gonna be able to serve our customers who are interested in that, as well as learn from that ourselves, put together some case studies, figure out, what the needs are in our communities so that we can then just leverage those learnings for everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
I think I answered half your question, but I'll pause there.
I can give you a break and turn somewhere else and let you keep going.
Yeah, I think the last thing I'll just say, because you were starting to set up the infrastructure piece,
Exactly.
is just the importance to, like I mentioned, the partnership piece of this, with infrastructure. There's a lot of different things involved when you start thinking about a system, even within a territory or a state or across states. So I think that that's exciting to see. And then, particularly from the utility perspective, each state is governing each utilities commission. And so that's another really critical stakeholder to think about. You can make a beautiful map of charging across the country, but it's going to be a state by state conversation.
Mhm. That's a useful point, and I think brings us to the infrastructure conversation pretty smoothly. Is you know the infrastructure package we're currently seeing work its way through the Senate, is it has just as much ambition, as the Biden administration initially had regarding public charging infrastructure. You know, I guess my question for you, Sarah, is twofold. Really, is that investment a first step, or is it really the launching pad that we need to continue to grow, to catalyze additional charging infrastructure throughout the rest of the country? And B, to a point you mentioned, is how does that square with the different state level regulatory regimes that you're working closely with, specifically in a Michigan context?
Hmm. I do think it's going to be an important catalyst to get all the states pointing in the same direction, because right now each state is on its own trajectory. And you've got states that have ZEV mandates out there for zero emission vehicles already. You've got other states who have carbon reduction goals. And those are the states where you see much bigger utility programs in electric vehicles, because they've got that top cover mandate. So that the commission can say, okay, like this is part of a bigger picture. Because without that, a commission's job is to look very critically at a utility spend and decide at a cost benefit analysis what makes sense. And oftentimes these chargers don't make sense on a cost benefit analysis. You need to have that broader societal impact and perspective on it, which is just not the commission's job. And so they're doing their job, but having that top cover was really going to help. So I think a national top cover on that will point every state in the same direction. And I think you are going to see this cascade then, which will be pretty exciting in terms of having those conversations at state levels and then unlocking the opportunities and the focus for utilities as well as other players in the state.
Mhm. Lauren and Tom, I want to turn to you with your takeaways from kind of the current conversation around infrastructure investment, transportation infrastructure investment coming from the Biden administration, and kind of what your feelings are about what you see in the current package versus what you hope to see in the next year. I know a lot of what we talked about just a few minutes ago was the need for a real buy-in from the administration on a lot of those infrastructure items. Kind of what are those benchmarks that both of you are looking for? I think we'll start with Lauren, and then Tom will turn to you.
Yeah, thanks. The package that we're looking at now has a lot of really interesting signals, I'll call them, around the technologies that the administration understands and is looking to scale, because it has a direct impact on our ability to hit any of our um, existing Paris Agreement targets. Um, so it's really good to understand where they're leaning into. I mean, we see some dollars set aside for infrastructure related to airports. We see some dollars set aside for infrastructure related to carbon capture and sequestration, which is an area that we think we need to triple down on. So there's a lot of promising signals in the legislation as it's proposed now. We have been working on our side on an effort called Sustainable Skies Act, which Tom was somewhat alluding to earlier. It provides a tax credit for alternative fuels for aviation of upward to to $2 per gallon. And the reason that that is pretty important is because it actually closes that green premium between conventional fuels and alternative fuels. That is not in the infrastructure bill as it's laid out right now. Although we do have a lot of bipartisan support for it. So I think whether it's through this immediate infrastructure package that we're looking at right now, or future activities under the administration, it does seem to me that eyes are focused on the right issues to help scale and address the issues. The last thing I'll say to Sarah's point is that it's really easy, I think very concretely and focused within my spectrum of aviation, but really where we are when you look across the United States and the transition to clean energy, is really at a place where we have to reflect on the entire power infrastructure and that transition. And so, when I think about the future of aviation and some of the pathways to decarbonize aviation, we have massive assumptions around access to clean, cheap, renewable power, which frankly does not exist right now across the United States at every market. And so, reminding ourselves, regardless of our industry and our immediate constraints on how we operate, that we have to keep a clean eye to this broader energy system that Sarah was talking about. Because if we don't move that to really, truly a clean energy infrastructure, a lot of the downstream trickle effects across multitude of industries, it's going to be compromised, because we really need to sort of build from the bottom around the power sector, and then that you're afforded the ability to electrify all the things you can, capture the CO2 and repurpose that in a closed loop cycle, or however you decide. But it relies truly on a future of clean power.
100%. And I think Sarah, I want you to give you a brief chance to weigh in on this conversation about before we turn to Tom, increasing access to clean, cheap, renewable power. We have a question in the chat asking specifically about whether about solar and how that might be a priority for expansion. Any thoughts you might be willing to add there would be, I think, would be useful at this juncture.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting milestones in just showing progress for the utility industry is, I think it was 2018, transportation overtook utilities, or transportation overtook the power sector in terms of overall emissions. And so I just think that's showing kind of like where we're heading and where we've been able to embrace cleaner technology on the utility side. And it's really interesting to hear Lauren and Tom talk about some of the challenges in fuel, because I think that's got to be the next frontier. But on the utility side, we're driving ahead with solar and wind. As I mentioned, 60% of our energy by 2040, we're aiming to be from renewables. And the majority would be from, the rest of that majority would be from natural gas. So I do think it's critical. And what's interesting about solar, I guess, is, you can scale it up or down. It's harder to do that with a wind turbine, but you can scale solar up or down. And if you think about, it's a very attractive idea to think about a charging depot with solar attached to it that's supporting that, for example. So I think there are some interesting opportunities in the mobility space there.
Tom, I don't want to forget you, and I want to give you the opportunity to weigh in on this conversation around policy and the infrastructure package. What are your thoughts there? And because UPS has, to the point Sarah made just a few minutes ago about, the services that utilities such as Consumers Energy are now offering, fleet-based companies, UPS falls in that category. It's a two-part question, I think. What are you looking for additionally out of the administration by way of infrastructure support? And then how are you thinking about the issues surrounding, your fleets and possibly electrifying or decarbonizing those specific kind of trucks on the road?
Yeah, sure. So this is sweet spot stuff for us right now, needless to say. And it's, the current longest running joke in Washington is that this is infrastructure week, because we've been talking about this for how many years? Years and years. And it seems like we're making some headway. The administration, to their credit, whether this current package might not be perfect, but obviously it's a significant investment and record number dollar-wise, the breadth and scope of investment in infrastructure kind of from a macro perspective. The pieces they have related to clean energy and new energy sources, and electrification specifically, are a starting point, but there needs to be more than that. And I think, because this thing may get watered down, it may get changed. It wasn't what they originally proposed, of course, but it's a real good start. I mean, from our perspective, we've got to think a little bit about, I think Sarah referenced it, you've got small delivery fleet vehicles that historically, you can experiment and use different fuels on them that are cleaner burning and reduce your carbon footprint. Heavy duty vehicles are different, and we've got the whole range problem. You've got the topographies and geographies they work in, power issues, the size of the batteries, as Lauren alluded to earlier. So, developing, there's a huge, there's various cottage industries of innovators that we're working with and that are popping up every day, calling us on something, saying, hey, we got the greatest idea since sliced bread and bottled beer. And we hear that all the time. And I'm sure Sarah's company hears it, and Lauren's hears it as well. But the issue is, On the heavy duty trucking side, we need to make some headway. And there's a couple things we think that could help that from a policy perspective. And then we'll get a little bit deeper. And again, tax incentives for medium and heavy duty vehicle purchases. They exist for light duty purchases, but for heavy duty vehicle purchases, heavy duty vehicles are what we call class 7, 8 commercial vehicles. Those are tractor trailer types. There's no break right now to buy a clean burning tractor. That's the power unit. And it costs, 1.5 times a conventional diesel one. So if you're paying 50% or 70% more for a liquefied natural gas or gas CNG powered tractor than you are for diesel one, that's a big nut to do the right thing. And people expect that of big companies, but small and medium-sized trucking companies, that's really difficult for them. So we do need some help on the tax incentives there. Uh, Second prong of it is tax incentives for the installation of EV infrastructure. We are working with companies like Saris because we've got some buildings in remote areas or rural and super rural areas where we don't know if we have sufficient power running from the grid, so to speak, to the building. We can fuel, it can operate the UPS building today, but the UPS building tomorrow that would have all these charging stations for electric vehicles, that's a challenge. So we've worked with utilities, and it's a good way to get the proverbial win-win, but we need to do that moving forward. But there also needs to be potentially some tax incentives for the installation of that kind of electric vehicle charging infrastructure or equipment, if I may, on our own property. And lastly, and this is the piece that the big bill right now is kind of got wrapped its arms around, which is the public electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Now, it might not benefit UPS to have public charging infrastructure, frankly. Why? Because our folks, 95% of them, either start and end at a UPS facility on a daily basis. So we're not stuck in the middle of rest stops. We're not stuck at truck stops in the middle of America. We're not. But it's important for the whole rising tide and to move industry forward for public infrastructure. So we've kind of taken what we think is the high road. We're advocating, lobbying, if you will, for public EV charging infrastructure that's off UPS property, of course, but that the public can use. That would be commercial vehicles as well as passenger vehicles. And that will help on the whole range anxiety issue, which is a real issue. So, and I'll close with this. We have areas in the country where we right now have natural gas refueling facilities on our UPS property that we allow other fleets to fuel at. It goes back to the point that I think Sarah referenced earlier on working together and collaborating. I hate that overused term, but it's so true. The public-private kind of thing, working with local municipal governments. If they're going to give you a grant to put in a fueling station on your property in Pittsburgh, UPS, you've got to allow the local fleet next door to use it on your property as well. That makes sense. How can we argue against that? So those are the kind of creative things that we're doing, but in all honesty, we need to do more of moving forward. I think that was the first part of the question, Reed. I'm not sure the second, but there's a lot here to unpack, so to speak. And I think there's a lot of various stakeholders that are interested and all interested, but we're getting our arms around it together. For example, us working better with power distributors and with utilities. That's something we need to do more of, and that's not necessarily a government role, right? That's the companies in the private sector getting together. But I'd say this to folks who are out there listening. If you're veteran, non-veteran, you're younger, and you're trying to enter the industry, so to speak, transportation, energy, I think in the transportation space, there's two really cool spots to enter right now. One is on automation, because we're changing on the automation side, autonomous vehicles, whatever the mode is, air, ground, ocean, on the autonomy side, or on the fuel and energy side. I think the energy side too, per our whole conversation today, those are two cool areas to enter, and actually area where we have needs for young, smart folks to figure it out and build careers, not a job, but a career. Now, you may say, well, I'm not technical. I'm not an engineer. You may not be. The other thing you do then is learn the freaking business. You learn the operations, how it works, how you unload an aircraft, how you sort packages, how you work with folks that are out repairing transmission lines. If you learn the business, and you want to be smart and ingenious and figure out your own path from that point on, you got a huge advantage because learning the business is critical, and the autonomy and the future energy supply issues, they're not going away. We'll need more people that understand that, but we need people that understand the business to make the business case as well.
I think you draw on an important thread. I think I wanted to get to eventually, which I think we'll just take care of now, which is it is the ideas around workforce development, right? Ultimately, kind of the ethos of this conference is talking about the value and potential skills and experiences that the veterans community brings to can bring to an advanced energy economy. When between the three of you, and I think, Tom, you alluded to a lot of these pieces already, is when you look at your workforce and skill needs associated with your decarbonization goals, in broad strokes, what are you looking for? What kind of skills do you think are currently needing to be filled? And how is that informing kind of, your thinking when you go out to, look for that talent? I think, what we heard from Tom. I'll turn to Sarah first, particularly given, your experience as a veteran. I think we'd be particularly interested to hear your perspective on that issue.
Yeah, well, I liked where Tom started, and so what I heard was one is, if you are technically minded, lean into that, and dive into a company and help develop new technologies and innovations. The second one was the operations side of it, which I think is another really nice natural fit for veterans transitioning. The third one I would add to that is project management. So how do you keep everyone marching in the same direction? Particularly with these new businesses, that's even more important. And that can be, industry agnostic. And I think transitioning veterans can readily drop into a role like that, to kind of just figure out like what's the plan, what are the objectives, how do we march everyone the same. So that way you can learn the business or learn the technology over time, but you're providing that critical just structure around let's all march in the same direction. So I don't want to underemphasize how important that is, even more so in an industry that's still emerging and trying to be figured out. Being able to put a little structure around that I've found to be really helpful. And that's been a big part of the role that I've done here, as well. But then I've been like learning the other parts as I've gone. So I think that's a great one. And I'd say like the sibling of project management is like the strategy side of it. So what's the mission? What are the objectives? Like what is the backwards planning you need to do to get there? So those are all skills I think veterans walk off the job with, that you can very much apply to this industry.
Lauren, I'd like to from you next. I think there's one specific question currently in the Q&A as it relates to, how do you train a new workforce? You're dealing with, eventually completely new engine systems, right, on your aircraft, right? What are those challenges looking like for United, looking out to its decarbonization plans?
Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna answer this question with a couple of different themes. So first, I talk to folks a lot about how do I break into sustainability? How do I start a career in addressing our climate change challenges? And the based on my experience and all the folks that I've talked to and worked with in my career, there is no single path. I mean, this is one of those professions or careers that you have to lead from the heart. And I suspect that resonates with the veteran community, where you've given multiple years of your life living for or starting leading from your heart around what you believe in. And so if you find that addressing sustainability, climate change, decarbonization, all of these massive challenges that are affecting every single industry out there, lead from your heart. That's the best advice I could possibly give you. Every single industry in every corner of the planet is going to be figuring out their strategy as it relates to going carbon neutral or greenhouse gas emissions neutral. That is a given. So it's a question of where do you plug in? So that's sort of a philosophical response. A practical response is, so within aviation, we just went through a massive contraction last year, and you heard about it in the news. We got the government bailouts. Fortunately, that allowed us to hold on to much of our workforce, but not as much as we need. And we're expecting a lot of growth in this space in the coming years. And my job in all of this is to make sure that we do it with an eye to sustainability so that we can honor and maintain this beautiful planet of ours. But there's a lot of roles across aviation that are required to be filled, whether it's customer service reps, whether it's technicians and maintenance. We just announced this year a program called United Aviate Academy, which is a pilot training program that will be, I think it's based in Denver, and we're training the next generations of pilots. So even if you have experience or not, you don't need it to sign up for this program, and we offer scholarships. So mechanism that enables and passionate around aviation and potentially flying to get your foot in the door where it's very expensive to fly. So that's an area in which, United is expecting to really plus up across all of its different business units and its different functions. The last thing I'll leave you with is really just sort of going back to the clean energy transition that we're talking about here. Whether it's working, with utilities such as Sarah's group, working on the manufacturer side, working in sort of commercial facing products and services like United does, we are all going through a massive transition right now. And whether it's small business or publicly traded. So it's hitting us in a multitude of different directions too. So there's a bit of a perfect storm of, those folks that are interested in getting involved in decarbonization, sustainability, climate change issues as it meets businesses. And there's a lot of folks out there that are scratching their heads on the business side saying, oh my God, what do I do? So my best advice to everybody here that's listening today is don't assume you're not qualified, because the people that I hire are the ones that have the passion, and you don't need experience in this field to necessarily demonstrate the passion.
I guess, Tom, I'd like to turn to you kind of to give you another, you put us on this particular question as it relates to workforce development. Anything else, either from Sarah or Lauren that you'd like to add to, or think is, that beyond what you've already said, kind of really sticks out in your mind as a necessary piece of, what workforce development tools your UPS is going to need over the next several years?
Well, I agree with my colleagues, what they said, but I'll tell you this. I mean, you can't create yourself overnight into being a STEM person, but we're all about the STEM these days. People that understand technology, that understand programming, understand engineering. I mean, if I had to do it over again, Reed, and I've been at UPS for 31 years, maybe I wouldn't have been a lawyer. I would have been an engineer, honestly, understand how things work. And if you can't do that, there's jobs to be had. Hey, it's a wonderful job market in the trucking industry. Just again, the industry itself, think trucking only now. Most trucking analysts believe there's 60,000 jobs opening, that the driver jobs that are opening. So fancy way to call a truck driver is to call them a commercial vehicle operator. There are commercial vehicle operators around the country. Every single trucking company is looking for people, including big firms and big national carriers like FedEx and UPS, who traditionally just promote from within. You drive by facilities and you see signs out all the time, now hiring. I guarantee you see them in Michigan, Sarah. Whenever I'm on the road, I see them on the side of the road. I'm kind of wired that way. All the big firms are hiring. So if people want to enter the truck driving business, the commercial vehicle operator business, which is becoming less dirty, if you will, than it used to be, less grimy, less of a grind. It's a hard job, but you're working with a lot more technology than you used to. And the working conditions have gotten a lot better. And what the trucking companies are doing, frankly, is they're competing. They haven't done a good job on workforce. So what are they doing? They're just outbidding each other and raising wages and rates for folks who start to drive. And that's a good thing for the employees. So people in the industry are going from one trucking company to another trucking company because they're getting a better deal. They're not, new entrants have been hard. There's been a lot of, and it's related, there's been a lot of efforts over the years in the trucking industry now, this trucking specifically, to try to move veterans in. And the trucking industry has been modestly successful at it. I'm not going to say wildly successful, but the thought would be, folks who come out of the service under good work ethic, they can, in some instances, have done similar kind of work. They've approached problem solving, like Sarah had alluded to earlier. So there are jobs, there's entry level and worker jobs to be had out there, and we got them, and our competitors have them right now. Absent that, if I could do it over, I'll be redundant here. I'd focus on STEM issues, because I think that really is how we're going to solve a lot of these macro problems as it relates to transportation, mobility, sustainability, and energy. I hope the hell that's the way we solve the sustainability problems, frankly.
We have a question from the chat that it's actually rather thoughtful and kind of brings us a bit back to where we started with each of you referencing kind of the forces that are kind of directing your respective companies to move in this decarbonization direction. The question says, as we kind of move, as this transition begins to take off, do you see there any sort of risk to increasing prices for mobility and energy? And how do you, Tom, you mentioned the tax credit associated with those vehicles. How do you manage that piece to make sure that we don't have disadvantaged communities paying the price for the energy transition as we move forward? It's a bit of a tricky question, but I think it's one that we all need to grapple with as we kind of consider what our goals are and what impacts they might have. I'll leave that to anybody who wants to try and tackle that one.
Well,
I
I
see
can,
Sarah unmuting herself, so we'll go first to her.
yeah, I can speak from the utility side because I do think there's a unique factor at play here that really only utilities can do, which is like we provide like electric and gas services to all customers on our grid, and then those costs are spread out around amongst everyone. And so again, with electric vehicles, that increased load onto the grid is going to mean that those costs overall go down for everyone. And if we are able to have people charge at in the middle of the night, where we don't need to add more power plants onto the grid, that means we can have that additional load without more costs, and that is going to benefit everyone, whether you have an electric vehicle or not. So it's kind of a unique perspective, but I feel like it's one of the biggest opportunities about having electric vehicles more of them onto the grid. So that's one thing that we're really motivated by, is working with customers, helping them understand why charging off peak matters so much.
Lauren or Tom, any thoughts from either of you in terms of how do we make sure that the costs of this decarbonization transition don't fall immediately back onto the consumer?
So it's a great question, Reed. And what I'll offer is this. In the spectrum of alternative fuels for aviation, we rely on that as a pathway for a significant portion of our portfolio. What we're seeing, the economic modeling we're seeing is that the cost of sustainable fuel, low carbon aviation fuel, will be cheaper than crude based fossil fuel oil. So it's a matter of when. For example, one of the companies that United has invested in, they literally take trash out of the landfill and convert it to a low carbon jet fuel. The cost of taking that trash out of the jet fuel and making the conversion happen, the product that you get is less expensive than the whole extraction process and shipping process in the Middle East and refining and the complexity of how we do it today. But it's going to take a while for the infrastructure to be built to support it so that the cost can come down and economies of scale can be realized. So until then, there's a bit of a bridge where there is this green premium associated with some of these lower carbon products. And that's why, as Tom mentioned, the role of government stepping in and helping to basically provide a bridge to this future of lower carbon markets is really, really important. The next thing I'll say, though, is that, we need to be eyes wide open about someday we will be pricing carbon. Today we don't. It's not going to happen in the near term. We all recognize that. But in some space of time, in a global capacity, we will be looking at pricing carbon. Some of the countries in the European Union are beginning to look at that with some of their border taxes. That means the adjustment in those products that are currently created using fossil fuel, it's going to level out because right now that cost of carbon and the impact to the environment is not factored into the price of that good or service. That equilibrium, I believe, is going to come back over time. Now, how, when, I have no idea. But right now, it's not factored into some of our commodities. So I do think there's an expectation of that coming into sort of the formula and the economics of how we look at some of these.
Tom, any thoughts to that? And I mean, we would probably need another hour to cover carbon border adjustment and carbon pricing effectively. But any other thoughts on the passing of costs onto consumers?
Well, I just suggest, and I think it's kind of the generic business perspective on this, if the private sector can accomplish these objectives on their own, I think we're an awful lot better off than if we're mandated and forced to do them, because that's when we have costs that are passed on, and those costs will be borne in underserved communities or underserved sectors of our society, however you want to phrase it, because ultimately, one of the innate characteristics of the firm, if you will, is that we're going to pass on costs to make sure we are still a for-profit enterprise, and as a result, it's ultimately that happens to an extent. So the point is, again, if we can stay ahead of government mandates on these things and try to allow us the flexibility to try to solve some of these problems where ultimately will benefit everyone, we think we're an awful lot better off.
That's it. I think that's totally true, and I think we need to be mindful So much of the conversation around energy transition today is focused on energy justice and making sure that we're not forcing too much of the brunt of the energy transition on those underserved communities. With an eye to the clock, we have just a few minutes left. I would love to kind of close by asking each of you, of course, we spent a good chunk of time talking about workforce development, so we'll leave that be there. But, when you look at what will be undoubtedly a really, really impactful 3 years of policy-driven change in the transportation space, in the decarbonization space. What are the one or two big things that you are looking for that you hopefully see acted upon during that period that can really be impactful in terms of catalyzing this change? It could be something we've already spoken about over the past hour that you just want to highlight one more time, or it could be something that we completely missed. But otherwise, just as a summary, Lauren, we'll start with you. What are those two kind of big pieces that you think need to be accomplished?
Well, from my point of view, we can't afford not to act right now. And for us, as I said several times over, that is really then about engaging from a policy point of view in supporting the sustainable aviation fuel market space, providing the incentives that allow those producers to really scale. What's interesting about that is the demand is there. We will buy as much as anyone produces, but it's just simply not there. So the question becomes, how do you then use the power of policy to trigger supply? So that would be sort of my ask for today. But my ask for the future is really, I do think we're going to find ourselves in a place somewhere where we do price carbon. I don't know the framework. I don't know the policy infrastructure. I don't know how it's going to trickle down to prices and services. But I do believe that it's a must and it's going to happen. And I support that fully.
Let's see. Let's go, Sarah. Let's turn to you next.
Yep. I think number one, that national EV infrastructure is going to go a long way in terms of not only getting the infrastructure in the ground, but convincing consumers that we've got you and that you can drive where you need to drive. So I think that's huge. And then the second one is we just need everyone to buy an electric vehicle. We'll figure the rest out as we go. Thanks.
There we go. It's as simple as that. Okay, Tom, what are those two kind of those big pieces?
The big pieces are in a relative short term, next 4 or 5 years, is that we continue to have, at least on the ground transportation side, incentives for alternative fuels. Not just electricity now, but think about natural gas. I mean, everybody says we got to get off diesel, we got to get off gasoline, the internal combustion engine is going to be a dinosaur. Well, it's here for 10 years, maybe longer. And we need to incentivize that shift in behavior, frankly. We do. Think about it this way from a commercial perspective. The pandemic has taught us a lot of things, of course, some good, some bad, but we do know folks order a lot of things from home these days and just ship to the house. The whole market of moving packages and goods moving, broadly speaking, from business to business has shifted from business to residential, right, or business to consumer. We all know it and we see it every single day. It's changed our business dramatically and our competitors as well. That's not going away in a post-pandemic economy. We really don't think so. A lot of that's going to be sticky and it's going to stay, and as a result, we will consume more energy as we deliver final mile goods to people all around the country, and our competitors as well. So let's find better fuels to do that, more sustainable fuels, but let's incentivize the adoption of such fuels. Not just for a big company like UPS, but what if you're, Blakemore Delivery Inc., and you've got, 10 trucks, 100,000, 120,000. And that matters for a company like yours. So some of the things we advocate for, we think will be good for small and medium-sized businesses as well, not just the mega businesses.
That's, I as the founder and CEO of Blakemore Delivery Inc., I intend to purely use Lauren's vertical lift platform. So hopefully that, all those pieces tie together at the right moment. I can, be as big of a contributor to the transition as I can be. Well, hey, thanks all of you, especially to our panelists for this really productive conversation during Veterans Advanced Energy Week. And I particularly appreciate, Lauren, Sarah, and Tom, all of your perspectives were so incredibly useful. To everyone else, if you'd like to rewatch today's event or share the stream with a colleague, a cache replay will be available on the Atlantic Council's YouTube channel, as well as on all of our social media platforms. And coming next in our conference agenda in about 15 minutes or so, we have an exciting fireside chat with Indiana Senator Mike Braun, co-chair of the Senate Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. I'm pretty excited about how things are unfolding here at the Veterans Advanced Energy Week, and I'll be tuning in, so I hope you do as well. And so thanks again to our audience, thanks again to our panelists, and I hope to catch you all there as things move forward. All right, bye all.